So this is the last, and in a certain sense, the least of the faculty conversations, saved for last, because I think many people think Hernan is, for all of his creativity, for all the exuberance of his work, for the intensity of his work, the work that seems furthest from any serious intention to build or serious intention to act in the world. And so that's one of the principal goals I have today, is to consider that issue and to disabuse that as much as I possibly can. I realized as I was working on this lecture that I've been following his work a long time. I am a deep devotee of his work. I know a whole lot about it. In fact, I could keep you here for 4 hours and not even give him a chance to talk. So I'm going to try not to do that, but I'm going to try to touch on some of the major issues that I think are really important in his work. I don't know what this is, but when I looked up his work, this came up. So I just thought I'd show it. But he gave a lecture just by coincidence yesterday at Princeton, and all my students went, and so the day after I had them in a seminar. And again, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of surprise, but the questions that came up are characteristic questions that come up about Hernan's work. First of all, what makes it architecture? You know, why is it not fantasy? Why is it not illustration? In what sense is it architecture, or does it have a claim to be an architecture? Second of all, how could he ever hope or expect to have that built? Thirdly, how can I tell the difference between one and another? And I think this is the one question I think that the students really pressed me on. Like, they all seem alike, and it does. I mean, even though one can see that there are differences between one and another, it doesn't seem like the difference matter. You hear this a lot with Gary, and you hear this a lot with anybody that's working in an idiosyncratic language. And so, those are some of the issues I would like to turn to tonight. And then finally, I would like to say a little bit about what I think is particularly his invention, even though you can derive it, or his contribution to the discourse, intellectually, aesthetically, culturally, and also technically. So when I teach, how do I make this, what do I do to make it advance? I don't hit arrows? Oh, this arrow. Wait, don't worry. I got it.
It's a Mac, but the principle is the same.
Macs are made for little girls.
Exactly.
That's why I have a whole lot of trouble with them. I like them for short times at a distance. This is what I teach as the foundation for architecture. These are the two prototypes of architecture. And frankly, they account for almost all of the sensibilities, all the constructions. They account for all of the affective dimensions. They explain entirely Harry's lecture the other night. Not only do they explain entirely Harry's lecture, they explain entirely the popularity of Harry's lecture. And in a second, I want to turn my attention to that, meaning not only are they profound, not only are they deep in their meaning, but they're also sober. In every way, they seek timeless values that transcend, that have that broach no, they're tolerant, but they're not particularly interested in anything but rectitude. And so these are the great values of architecture, and they stand as the armature of all architectural thinking. These are not the full spectrum of humanity, and every discipline finds its apotheosis, literature, music, even the sciences, even medicine, even mathematics, when it explores the full range of its capacity to find out its relationship to human life, to cosmology. And architecture's really had a struggle with this, to find how does it deal with absence of rectitude or lack of rectitude? And so I point out that at the very same time these were done, this is done. This is the broken or red pyramid. It's one of my favorite. And also the magician's pyramid in Uxmal. Now, every time you see one of these pyramids with these fantastic curvatures, they're always associated with magic, locality, mystery, with all sorts of values that these other ones, not that one, that these aren't. And so I think I would be first, if I've always thought of myself as thinking, this is where you would have to trace the ambitions to speak to the life through architecture that suffuses Hernan's work. It traces to this urge, and this urge is not only deep and persistent and finds itself in materialization in every field, but also expresses itself in almost every period and in every possible way. Now I need to show a little bit about Harry's, so how do I get to the desktop? Escape. Ah. So it is very much like a normal thing. Okay, so this was quickly Harry's, you know, I put this together for you guys. I mean, Harry, like I said, is a purveyor of rectitude. But there's always something really bothered me about Harry. Oh, is it up there? Okay, so, you know, John Hancock. But there's this thing about the black stripe. He will never talk about the black stripe, and when he talks about the black stripe, it's just nonsense. He just says it lines up with the core. And so the black stripe is in this building because it lines up with the core. And then you say, well, why did you paint it back? And he says, well, makes the facade more interesting. And you have never heard him say anything like that before. So I keep looking at this building, and it looks like it casts a shadow. So there is something in Harry, some mysterious, and it's this. Harry has a kind of dark side. And, you know, and it goes on and on and on. So what I'm saying is why everybody likes Harry is not just the rectitude, but you can always find this dark side. So just to cut this short, this is two of my favorite buildings he did at Harvard. And when you're walking down the street, it's that. Like you see the building on the left, you think, well, that's kind of a normal dumb building with a circle on the top and a square on the bottom. And then you go a little bit further and you see, turn to your right, and then you say, oh my God, you know, that is the scariest thing I've ever seen. But I was looking at his lecture the other night, and I realized it's this. He just copied Korb and put it back on, you know, Korb was kicked off of the main quadrangle. Cobb was kicked off of the main campus for his only building on Harvard. So he was complaining with Korb, so he just reinstalls Korb. Then I went through this transposition, and I realized that not only does this formal exercise turn the Carpenter Center into Harry's building, but if you use the same exercise, you can turn the B in Cobb into R, and it changes Cobb into Korb. And then finally, however, I discovered this. I'll hit escape again. I just want to show you how horrifying Harry really is. So go to Harry. Then I made this little film. And this is a film of the installation. And I can make it bigger, but you can just watch it from here. So it turns out that this very docile installation, based on 3-foot by 8-foot doors, because they're humane sized, is the scariest and most horrifying installation in the history of SCI-Arc. You can hide 40 people in it, and they can attack you at any point in time. It becomes the most evil possible urban environment. And so this, I think, means that within all architectures, there's this impulse for precisely the same kinds of emotions and affects that, So, Harry, by the way, of course, loved this immediately, told me I was just an idiot for the other stuff, but wants this film. So, that's why I think it's really important to explore the full range. Now, I gotta get back, so get out of this thing, hit stop, and then get back to my lecture. So like in my own world, this would be so easy. Now what? Oh, hey, lecture. Kipnis. No.
Go back. Which one you want?
My PowerPoint.
Go to Harry's folder.
Go to what?
Harry Folder.
Harry Folder. Yep, okay. There. And then hit this. There you go. Okay. Thank God this is the last time I ever have to do this. And then I go to here. Okay, so now I'm just quickly going to show you something like the history. Some of these are out of order. And then I hit what? This. I know it.
That's PowerPoint, so.
I know all about it. Okay. And so you should be seeing it, and there it is. So this is just a quick move, you know. This is later, it should be later on the slide. This is Grimshaw using Etvi and others about, this is how easy it should be able to build some of this work, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later. And these are examples of buildings in the world today that already have the sensibilities, but this is the case I wanted to look at now. You know, I love this painting too, but what can I say? That joke has worked for years. Now, it would be very easy for me to put up Bacon. Francis Bacon is Hernan's favorite painter. His work speaks very much to it, but I put these up because this is the section about how does one think about appreciating Hernan's work, one at a time. If you know Liechtenstein, these two paintings are from the same time. This painting is from 15 years later. It all seems the same. It's in the same style. It's very graphic. It's very hard to tell one from another. And so you really have to be an expert. You have to pay very close attention. And so it's not really that he's changing, for example, from cartoons from the newspaper to quotations of Cubist paintings to interiors. It's more like these Ben-Day dots were not modulated in the first paintings, and then he started to practice the modulations, and then he started to use the modulations. And so as you study the work over and over and over, and then he introduces the diagonals, and then he practices different procedures with the diagonals. So over 40 years, each painting explores another technique in the graphic, and they develop. And so you have to pay attention to the work at that level over a long period of time and closely, and then you get a really strong sense of what's going on in the work. And that's what happens is you get to this painting in the last year of his life, and all of a sudden all of the features show up because for the last 40 years he's never done anything but without deviation except use those strong black graphic outline. So for the first time, he then breaks those down. So you see all of the diagonals and colors and modulations and figures, but now he breaks down the outline, and now you can form an expert connoisseur appreciation of the power of the painting project. And this is what you have to do with Hernan's work. You really have to study each project one at a time, take a look at it, and see what is moving in small detail from the one before that and how that happens. And if you don't do that, then it's going to be true, exactly what you say. They're all going to look alike, just like Bach's music all sounds alike if you don't do that. And what I really like about Hernan is, let's say against someone like Richter, he stays in an idiom and he explores that idiom. He'll change it. He'll change themes of it, having to do with exploring different emotions, the grotesque or the rococo. But mostly it's about pursuing these kinds of fineries. And so now I restore some of the black lines so you can tell that these are really profoundly different paintings. And you would have to go back and do that kind of work on Hernan, or just study it close enough to really begin to realize how deep the work is and how far out of, by comparison to anyone else that might be seen to be in the same idiom as him, it's by itself in the world. So the construction, a lot of people don't know this. I mean, he has always been in construction. He's always wanted to build. When Jesse and I got a commission to do this building, this is one of my only built works. I don't know if you know this, and I did this with Jesse. We hired Hernan to figure out how to build this building. Do y'all know this story? And so Hernan came with the idea that, this was the brick building was an existing building, and the other thing was an addition. And he said, look, what we need to do is build this, and then undo a screw, and then we get it. So he was using He's using flow theory to let the building self-construct. And I've always appreciated his understanding of it. He said he learned that technique from Enrique Marias at a project I can't quite remember. Y'all will know what I'm talking about. So, but look how much of this has been needed in the world, and in every possible dimension, and in every political exercise, and in every materiality, and from Rococo to onion domes, to power plant elements, to giant legs of dams. In fact, I thought to myself, it should actually be in principle easy to kind of put together a Hernan project out of found elements. And by the way, these are now incredible tourist sites. There are whole tours about visiting industrial behemoths, and this is Kawasaki in Japan. Plus folk art. You see folk art that has exactly the same collective sensibility. This is the Forevertron in Wisconsin, which I think has a wonderful lyric, poetic resonance with Hernan's work. That's for you, Hernan. Turned out to be too expensive. I was going to buy it for you. It's not by Damien Hirst, but it's pretty good. Okay, so now, if you'll remember the Liechtenstein, I asked Hernan to put a little something together for me. So Hernan has done two things. He took the idea of using animation software that he learned with his work from his work with Greg. There you go. I got it. Oh no, it's like the Twilight Zone. I escaped to the same place. I hit escape.
What do you need?
To get out of this. I need to show your video. Okay, so, but instead of using animation, and I think you know how Greg uses it, he uses animation to design the projects in a way no one ever else has even conceived. I mean, the animation. Yeah, so I'll talk. So now this is a brief history of Hernan's animations. The animation is the design instrument. So what you'll see is not only is the gift of animation increasing in its technique, but also the intimacy of detail that we sort of discussed in Roy Lichtenstein, you can see appearing as issues that occur in the animation itself. And so it's not a drawing tool that then gets stopped, turned into a project. It is the production of the project itself in a way that no one else, I don't think anyone else uses and also appreciates quite the intensity with which the unbroken relationship between the animation. So these are not, for example, presentation animations at the end of a project that show the project. These are the production of the project. These are the drawing of the project. These are the conception of the project. These are the development of the project. And these are the presentation of the project, all in the same instant. And so to understand that is to understand architecture being worked in an entirely different medium, and let's say eye-to-hand relationship, an eye-to-thinking relationship. And it also means that he's developed the animation technique not sort of from film or about film, but from thinking architecture. So you will see, for example, it go through a Rococo period, or you'll see it go through a onion dome through period, or you'll see it go through various attitudes about how it joins a site, how it meets a building. But at the same time, you'll see how he's learning to do more in the animation. So it's hard to say if that's architectural development or animation development. So the tendrils. Now, as we'll see when we look at some of the physical models, some of these come from accidents that actually happen in the physical models that then get exported, turned into ideas in the animation, and then get developed. So these little tendrils first show up as an accident of model making that occurred in a San Francisco installation. I'm sorry, that occurred in the PS1, is that right? Yeah, occurred by accident in PS1, and then get intentionalized in SF MoMA, then become the Rococo filigree from that point on. And so there is a dialogue between real materiality in the physicality and the animation, but the animation is its, so again, I'm hoping as you're looking through my commentary. So, you know, he gets interested in butchery. There's a literal moment of butchery. There's a kind of dome period. And the, yeah, I guess got maybe one more minute. So what I was trying to say is none of the behaviors are behaviors about animating an effect for a kind of illustration of an effect for a client or illustration of effect. It's about it's about presenting an effect in the film that should somehow affect the architecture. So the little jitter that you just saw now becomes double gauzing. It shows up as a physicality in the actual modeling itself. So you can keep, it has a linearity that's compulsive. So the skin detailing first shows up early on, and now it's relentless. And you know, when he has to do a project with some contextual obligations, he can do it. I mean, there's straight line, there's straight facades when it needs to be, like at the Guggenheim Museum. I think this is the Guggenheim Museum, and so he knows how to make a building seem like a building on the site. He clearly wanted to. I mean, I don't think he clearly thought he would win the building, but it works in plan. It works in. This would be. I don't think there would be any problem whatsoever building this building at all. The question about the will to build in architecture is probably slightly misstated, and I think this is right now my favorite project, because this project is so clearly easy to build. The materiality of the, you know, you could think of this as FD and titanium, and you can probably detail it immediately, and that's why I wanted to show you the Grimshaw work in FD and the biodomes. Now, so the other thing that I think is important about Hernan, and I'm about to close this off. Okay, so now I get to this other. Now, just quickly go through some of his own material out. It'll say 190 slides, and don't worry, we're not going to stay on that forever. Okay, yeah, there it is. Wait, I don't need you. Go away.
No, it's not that one.
It's not that one.
No, it's not that one. We have one for you special.
The last time he serves me. Okay. So first thing he does, after he starts here, I think he starts here in 2002. And I'm not going to belabor the whole history of his relationship to other faculty. I think it's pretty clear at this point. But I'm going to start with this project. So early project, and so we're going to try to follow a little bit of the. This is a bridge. This is a bridge that he's building, that he's designing for construction right now in Barcelona. Am I correct? Barcelona. And I want you to, because what I think it's slightly misstated about will to build, or the idea that architecture has to be an urge to find itself in the world. I think that's true, but I think it has to be an urge to find itself in the world through others. So it's like a composer is not someone who's out there performing like an improviser or a busker. He's writing stuff down as instructions that he needs to get someone else to play and someone else to pay for it to play. So an architect, I think, is that. It's not really trying to get something built, it's trying to get someone else to build it. And I think this is a really important distinguish, and I think you have to see that in the attention to drawings. And I think I was raising that last week with Elena's work. She really doesn't need to draw all that stuff that way, but it's about the tradition of producing instructions. And it's about the tradition of producing instructions that you can use to make arguments. So it has both qualities. How to tell a person that's going to build it, and how to ask the client for money or get regulations, get the regulatory process. So here's the bill, and so every detail is, the idea that you would, there's a moment on here, it says typical structural moment. This is a cloth pedestrian bridge. All these. And so the images are not as important to me, they are, as the drawings. And so the drawings are typical transmissions from one architect to another. These files are gigantically large for reasons I can't figure out since the lines are so thin. But these are the things I really like. I like minutiae, and when we look at the construction drawings for PS1, what you just see is a broken toothpick measured. You see 9 exactly measured broken toothpicks. And so it's this conviction in the drawing. I'm sure it's easy to produce this from the technique of the digital process, but nevertheless, the conviction in it and it's not the ease. I remember him constantly showing the section of a croissant or whatever by Marias that I think suffuses the work, and it continues to convince me the work keeps me interested in reading it as an impulse for architecture and a desire to be in the world, and a desire to continue a tradition that always comes in and out, that always is too hot, too cold, and then requires a period of just right, too hot, too cold. And so I hide behind that. I hide in the sense that I prefer to discuss architecture at the level of affect, a kind of suppressed emotion, or an emotion, letting architecture mobilize the possibility of an emotion. But I also admire work like Eric's and Hernan's that actually has the courage to mobilize emotions, but in the full knowledge that it, in the end, will exhaust. In the end, it cannot sustain the kind of background quality that quiet architecture does, and so that's why it comes and goes in the periodicities that it does. It doesn't mean, however, the urge never goes away. And so I'm 100% convinced that there will be Hernan Diaz Alonso or Zviro. If you could just change the name of that damn firm to something you could pronounce, it would probably happen a lot faster. How do you say it? Sefirotarch. I can say tar. Look at these. Don't you love those? Exact angles of toothpicks. What we need is 400 slightly bent measured toothpicks in bundles. Anyway. So now, the plans are, I think, something we might want to talk about. Do they show us a transformation of space? When we look at that, are we thinking about these projects as having a claim in space, having a claim in plan, having a claim of using function at all? Because I don't know that I see that in the work. So, for example, I see a really interesting moment in mature architectures. When you visit the pterodactyl, you'll see advances in Eric's work where it used to be the architectural adventure would sit outside the active space, and now the architectural adventure is either impinging inside the active space, or you have to leave and go to part of the adventure for a conference room. And so to actually find the direct engagement between the adventure and the quotidian, so that it's more than just an emotional form and materiality, so that the actual problem of not so much the use, but the problem of the function itself carries with it. It's as if you've written a great opera music, but you haven't got the libretto to collaborate yet with the music. And so that would be the apotheosis of the work, is when the words and the music of the poetry that comes with the function collaborates beautifully with the, so it's fantastic, I know, when you hear Vesta La Juba, you know, and the person has killed his husband, the clown has killed his wife, no, you know, Vesta La Juba, but then you hear it later on as no more Rice Krispies, no more Rice Krispies, we have no more Rice Krispies, sorry, opera. So, I show this because those little, those little sticky these things, were an artifact that occurred in the making of PS1 that he began to deploy in the work as part of the filigree. And then you can start to see it in the actual, these details, of sort of dimples with hairs. And that eventually becomes a major theme in the work, and that starts to show up in the animations. Oh, thank you. So I don't know. My hope would be that it now becomes easier and easier and easier to see the work as different, and easier to see how it matters at scale, how it uses. It's, you know, now it's finally it's taking on actually an animated. And that here's a drawing. I don't know if it's still in here. Here's one of my favorite moments. You know, so all of these are drawn as architecture. They're all of the elements, the twist. This is now a fully Rococo set of work on this display system. We're about ready to talk about this. So it's, I don't know, for me, it's just beautiful in the degree to which each one is so different from the other. I wish there's, and when we get to Boeing, I'll just show you, I'll go quickly. And now, for example, the horns, I guess, suppose you're thinking about the butchery in this project, I'm not really sure. And so any sense whatsoever that these are repeating themselves or not developing immediately disappears if you just prepare yourself a little bit to watch for it. And they become a symphonic, it's like looking at the 9 symphonies, or more importantly, it's like listening to the developing work of Shostakovich, who I've actually compared him to before because it's so narrative in its, you know, it's unlike an abstract composer of the 20th century. He's very, I'm not sorry, more like Stravinsky. Very narrative, very late 19th century, early 20th century in his impulses. You know, starts with a literal representation of the cows, and then by the time it's at the chairs, these are the abstractions of the remnants of the cow's hairs in the body. It's fantastic. I mean, it's pictorial technique turned into animated technique, turned into material technique. For me, it's just breathtaking. And then there's one little, I find one little thing left, and then I'll let you go. Some pieces are, this is his only about to be built work. I don't know if it's exactly, he did this with, who did you do this with? Oh, Alex McDowell. This was for the Boeing, this is a kind of, something for Boeing. Yeah, customers experience, yeah, so, yeah. Like a really important thing for Boeing is that you go in there and you experience the future of their flight. You know, I mean, it taxed his, I'm sure it taxed his enthusiasm because of the degree to which it was subjected to all sorts of constraints, which I think but you know, he kept with it, managed well. Alex McDowell, they finished the project, it was ready to be built, had all kinds of epoxy. this is one of my favorite things. I hope I can find this, and then I'm gonna, oh yeah, look at this. The biggest thing in the entire thing, this is a degree of honesty that he brings to the work. The biggest speck in the entire thing is this. Like, I don't know. That's what I really like. I don't know how to spec this thing. I got to find out later. But I'm going to make sure I'm going to be honest with you, because you're not going to sue me. It's just really a beautiful note. So all this stuff is beautifully specced, and that's the project. I think I'll just leave it there. So now the modeling of the surface must seem to you like an extraordinary novelty in the work. You haven't seen it before. Where did it come from? What animation produces it? Why is it there? What emotion is it about? Is it a change in theory? Is it a change in his, is it a widening of his understanding of what causes a sense of the grotesque or the horrific or the elegant or the beautiful? What's its project? I just want to skip to this last project, and I've already showed it to you in animation, not this one. This project I think is, probably has no chance at all, or probably, since is the competition finished yet? But as straightforward a building as it could possibly be, and probably not very expensive if you compare it to the Grimshaw projects I was showing you, which, I think it's simple, two materials, a basic structural system, easy entry, an expedient structural system, fantastic presence in the park. And that's it. So, Hernan, will you join me?
It's a weird thing to see your work completely misunderstood in a clever way. No, it was great.
I have a collection of emails from the most famous architects in the world that say exactly the same thing, It's my job to it's your job to convey your understanding of the work. It's my job to bring the work alive in its own. So you wouldn't want me to go, you wouldn't want me to say, "Guy, I really want to get to know you really well, Hernan. I'm going to go meet your parents. I'm going to really interview your parents. I'm going to learn everything I can about you from your teachers and your parents."
That would prove that you're absolutely miraculous, because both of my parents are dead. So you will manage to do that. I would be really impressed.
Being Kabbalistic in my background, I have certain techniques.
No, but I got your point. Okay. Yeah, no, it's fair. Yeah, it's true.
I was wondering, for example, and do you know? I'm just curious. Or does anyone know why the Russian onion dome tradition is there? Why? I mean, there's onion domes, ornate onion domes all over the world, but why it developed such a, and when you look up how it's built, it turns out to be fairly easy to build, but why it became such a remarkable and pictorial tradition all over Russia. And it did spread, but it only spread where Russian emigres went. And so you'll find them in Northern Europe, but I couldn't really figure that out, and I couldn't find any really history about not how great they were, but why they're there. Does anyone know? But I mean, they're clearly, I think, it would be a misinterpretation on my part to say they're there for emotional reasons. For example, birds don't sing. Birds say, "Let's have sex," or "Get the hell out of my tree." So they talk to each other very clearly, and they're not out there singing happy songs. So I'm pretty sure the onion domes are actually well thought out symbolic work with very specific cultural meanings, but they are also working, I think, at an emotional level. And I think you were at least explicit about that. I mean, you do associate your work not only with emotions, but with intense emotions that have to come and go quickly. For example, when you speak about the horrific or the grotesque, it's required of these to be effective that they're short-lived. And
Yeah.
generally, short-lived effects in art are considered not to be either desired or possible in architecture. I mean, in the sense that it's around too long.
Yeah. But, I don't know, in relation to this, I always, and this probably comes from the origin of not really wanting to be an architect. I mean, architecture was not my first choice. I kind of ended landing in it, so probably most of my aesthetics or conceptual ambitions always relate to something else. I went through that thinking the last 2 weeks. I spent a huge amount of time trying to put together a list of 100 buildings for Tom Main.
Oh, yeah.
Tom is doing this book. He asked 100 architects to choose 100 buildings. And I realized it was incredibly difficult for me because there's a lot of buildings I like, but I realized it would be much easier for me to talk about 100 things that influence my work. They have to do with a bunch of other things that is not necessarily architecture. So part of the effects that you're talking about is something that always interests me a lot, and it probably comes from my obsessions with films and other things. Like the notion of something horrific in film is something that it goes dated very, very fast. Like when you watch Psycho today, it's almost funny. But I'm pretty sure when the people saw that in a movie theater in the 60s, it probably was something really scary. So there is a temporal thing. But I believe that that applies to architecture too. I never believed this idea of the quality of the effects or the cultural value that is sustained over a year. Like, I don't know, when you go and see, let's say, if you see San Carlino, it's kind of amazing because it was made when it was made. Like, if you think that this was built last week, it wouldn't be that interesting. So I don't think that's true. I mean, I think to me it's one of the myths that we construct as a discipline, that something is, oh, Bill Savoy. You go to Bill Savoy and it blows you away because it's 1929. And in your head, you know this 1929, and that's what makes it interesting. But to me, it's super temporal. So I've never been interested at all in this idea of eternal life that architects seems to be so invested in.
So you think of your
So I'm
work-
totally okay that the work looks dated and it belongs to, but I think every piece of work in architecture actually looks dated. I don't buy that for a second. Even some of the most interesting architects, some of them are working here in SCI-Arc. I think the work looks dated. I mean, when we saw the show of the Heretics, it looks dated. It was super interesting, some of them, but it looks like it was 1970. Actually, it was a little bit, it even looked older than 79. And it's, to me, it's totally fine. So I never been interested in that at all.
But I mean, I find that interesting because Wolf, even with Eric, he doesn't care about his work being perceived in a historical sense. So if you go there, I mean, in some sense, he's interested in a naive audience, not in an audience. So, but you think of your work as being primarily appreciated by a knowledgeable or an architectural audience first. I mean, its effect on the general public is going to be something entirely different.
I'm just happy that there's somebody who cares about what I do. I mean, really, I don't know. I mean, I'm very much with Wolf and with Eric to understand. I mean, I really, some of the other great architects that we know, they're very obsessed about their legacy and so on. I don't fully understand. I'm pretty aware that what I do has a very limited audience and a very limited impact, and I'm okay with that. But at the same time, and I was saying this to the students in Princeton 36 hours ago, I don't know how to do anything else. So it's not like all these are like very careful, specific decision. It's what I do. It's what it comes natural to me. It's what interests me. These are my obsessions. I'm just glad that there is an audience at all. I mean, hopefully some of them will turn into buildings. Some of them are just rendered and make their way into books or at academic life or museums or whatever. But I'm not really that obsessed about historical relevance of any of that. I mean,
well, I know, but you...
I'm a very egocentric guy, but my ego doesn't go that way.
I know, but...
I mean, it's kind of a fucked up thing to think about the historical relevance of what you do.
I mean, I think that, I don't want I want to be the guy in the picture that everybody's famous except one guy, and there's it says unknown.
But the best quote
I always
about,
wanted to be that guy.
This is interesting for understanding. The best quote about famous architects, it was from your wife.
Yeah.
When she said, how do you care about somebody's famous when you're known about so very few?
I think
being a famous architect is what? They know you, what, 10,000 people in the whole world?
The quote is...
any second-rate basketball player is more known. So who gives a fuck?
The quote is, in small, medium, large, and extra large, it's never have so many been so famous to so few. My wife said it to Rem. He attributed it to me, which she thought just was perfect. It was, I think, the last time she ever even voluntarily went to a... She can't stand Rem. She loves Caesar Pelli for really simple reason. The minute you meet Rem at a party, he's looking around the room for the next most important person to go see. You meet Caesar Pelli at a party, his eyes are on you no matter who you are until you leave. And that's why he gets so much work. So,
there you go.
But, there are architects that wait for the problem.
Yeah.
And let the problem guide their work. I think even Andrew is that in a certain way. I mean, I was thinking today, the two people that I've done this entire time with, from Andrew, I began with Andrew and ended with you, you're the two I know the most. And even though Andrew has a very idiosyncratic approach to work, with a hard sense of its own attitude, he waits for the problem and then lets the problem guide the work. Yeah. You know what you're going to do next. And then whatever the problem is, you find a way to bring that thing you're going to do next to that problem. So
yeah, that is true. But I think the problem is important too. Like in all the projects that you show, any project that we done in the office, none of them were inventions. Like all of them were a competition or a museum or a client. We always work in an existing problem. We never work in a speculative project. Now, we try to have a speculative view in relation to the problem, and I have, let's say, a grammar or a language or a genre that I'm interested in developing at any particular time. And that, to me, is one of the things I would say I learn a lot from people like Enrique. And actually, most of the architects that I like and admire, and the artists I like and admire, they tend to operate like that. That there is a kind of body of work that you build, and they start finding opportunities to deploy that. So in that sense...
But then the value will always have to be either alibied in, like the value to the Guggenheim in Helsinki will have to be something you discover after the fact, or you have to argue that the value of the project that you're working on is intrinsically valuable to the case. There's no guarantee that the next step in your development, I mean, I know this to be true. It's true in Tom. It's true in Eric.
I would argue,
not true. Eric, I think, is a little different.
But I would argue that most architects actually are closer to my position than the other one. I think most architects like to argue about the problem and this and that. But when you look at the work, to me, it seems like they're always forcing to push their agenda into the problem. Even the most, let's say, more rational or conventional architects. So I think there is a discourse of what you need to do to get the project or the commission and so on. I think and then there is a real agenda. So I'm not so sure that is true. I mean, because if that were true, you will think each project that every architect does will be completely different than what they did in the previous version, and they're never that different. So it seems like everybody comes with a preload agenda to an extent. I would say at least the architects that I would consider that they are important in relation to the discipline. I think there is a whole other service industry that also have to do with architecture, which I think those are problem-based, and that's why each project that they do is completely different than the other one. But I think the ones that they have a certain cultural relevance, there is always a continuity that can be articulated. Now, most of us would like to think each project that we do is very different than the one before. And it's never completely true, but it's good to believe it. it's important to keep the ball rolling in that sense. But
So, I mean, what's the, I don't know how to say this, what's the benefit to Barcelona of the bridge? Of the bridge? I mean, you know, what are you, in other words, what's the bridge, let's say, what's the bridge about?
why my bridge will be better than somebody else's bridge?
No. I mean, first of all, what are you working on the bridge? What's your project in the bridge first? Let's talk about that first.
In a way, the bridge actually, as a series of ideas, it belongs to a series of ideas probably 8 or 9 years ago. It doesn't really belong to some of the most contemporary ideas, like the butchery and so on. Actually, the bridge goes back to some of the lines and curvature and more geometrical work that I was doing early on, like the concert hall and so on. So there was also an interest to establish a dialogue with what I would call an existing language in Enrique or Gaudí or Jujol that belongs to that particular culture. So there was a certain notion of explore a kind of a weak structural logic, so that which is something, if you look in most of the work of people like Mirages and others in Barcelona, is something very present there. And there is a kind of an oversaturation of columns. So the idea was to don't create a bridge, but it was much more to create like a forest that you can walk through. So that had to do with it much closer to PS1, or some kind of oversaturation of geometry than some of the most recent work that was much more based on mass and so on. So there was a certain practicality also that, for better or for worse, PS1, another project that we did at that time, we kind of figured it out, that how that can be built and so on. And this one was a certain immediacy that required that. But it was an interesting process too, because the first version that we showed of the bridge, we did for the bridge for them, was really completely straight, with the module on rotation we were trying to do in budget and so on. And as I was presenting to the client and the city, I can see the disappointment in their face. Like, we hire you because you will do something else, not in a straight line. So we said, well, we did this other one. Oh, we want that one. Well, that one costs 3 times the budget that you have. So without knowing, I was doing something that Frank Gehry does very often, which is giving the one that you can build and then show you the one you want to build and get them disappointed. So then but it was not so planned. It kind of happened. But this is the same with Boeing. In a way, when we were working in Boeing, as the pure abstraction of ideas, Boeing is very behind. Like, it was a project we were working in 2013, but the ideas belong to 2006, or things that we did for SF-MoMA, and that's okay. So,
but when I
was trying to work with the bridge was to work in something that it would not look like a bridge, it will not behave like a bridge, and it will behave like something else. Like, you will be walking through a park or something like that.
But it's not really a park, it's really a haunted forest. It's got eyes in it. It's got
but believe it or not, I don't think in that way. I think what I do is nice and happy and beautiful. I never think I'm doing something really.
And so those eyes on the floor that are staring at you from the ground.
Those are the spheres, and that's something we start to use.
Spheres with pupils.
Yeah, but I was interested in kind of a Platonic geometries to incorporate familiarity.
But you're just like Frank. You're really getting to be just like Frank. Oh, I don't really think that way. But I mean,
no.
It is quite frightening.
The eyes. But the point was this. Yes, and this is related maybe to the horrific and the grotesque and all that. When we start to work with Platonic geometry, it was a way to put certain things that were recognizable. If you look some of the early projects, there was not one recognizable Platonic geometry. Right. Everything was distorted and mutated and transformed and so on. At some moment, we start to put some recognizable thing, because first, it put people to recognize things and guide them to the formal behaviors. But the other one was familiarity, and certain kind of you can recognize make things more disturbing. You can recognize something as disturbing the moment, like, if you look at something like the paintings of Francis Bacon or David Sully or any of these guys who work on that, it became disturbing when you recognize that there is a recognizable thing that is there. If you don't have that, it doesn't really work. So that was very on purpose. And also there's a practical aspect. The moment that you have with certain Platonic things and so on, there are certain things off the shelf that you can get. So it allows you to stabilize formally, but also start to guide the project. And in this case, it will be a display system that we put. And then, of course, it can look like eyes and all that. And the eyes of Lara Mars and all those kind of movies from the 70s.
And the tendril-like quality of the trees, or the scale shift.
Yeah.
So you're aware of the pictorial effects that the park will have.
That's a pictorial effect, but actually it's a trick that I stole literally from Enrique Mirages. Enrique will always put a couple of things in any project that will completely off scale, that doesn't belong to the natural scale of things, which is something that actually he stole from northern carpenters. If you look at a lot of the furniture from the 19th century, 20th century, the legs, certain thing always seems to be bigger than need to be, and so on. So there is some kind of fable quality to it that I always thought is interesting. And also I think it never occurred to me until recently that my work is really about certain theatricality and drama, the narrative of that. And that notion of putting off a scale, it helps big time with those kind of operations. But I don't think, I think many people do that. I think Frank does that a lot. I think Eric does that a lot. I don't know if he does it on purpose or not. But there are certain things that doesn't seem to belong to the rest of the scale of the things. And do you know the when you're walking on the fabric? Yeah.
It's a fabric floor, right?
No, the floor is naval, is like a ship boot. I mean, it's a thing that you will use in boats.
Oh, but there's fabric.
And there is fabric. Instead to have handrails, it will have a whole series of fabrics, and it's like a bird nest thing.
So it's a rigid floor.
It's fairly rigid, but have a lot of movement.
Yeah,
according to Klaus Bollinger, which is the guy doing the structural thing.
And so it'll be kind
because
of...
I remember I walked in the Norman Foster Bridge in London before they reinforced it, and it was way cooler when it moves, even though people were super scared.
Uh-huh.
Then they had to reinforce it because people were scared about it. So I liked the idea that this thing could be...
Yeah, then you get two jobs. You get the first job, and then you get the job to reinforce it.
Yeah.
Good business plan. And it'll happen?
If they win the elections in May, maybe it may happen.
What's the budget?
The budget right now is 4.5 million euros, but the version that we're doing, it really goes to 6.2. So it all depends who are the developers doing. This bridge connects Barcelona with Sant Adrià de Besòs. There is a whole development happening in Sant Adrià de Besòs that will have foreign investors. So the city, the regional agency will pay for half of the cost of the bridge, and whoever gets the development of that area have to chip in the other half.
And so just one more question. The customary user would not be a tourist. It would be a local someone.
No, it's a combination of both. It's a strange area of Barcelona. It's where the Barcelona Forum is and so on. So actually, it's not really a nice area right now. So part of the idea is for them to keep continuing the beach. It's a very strange pedestrian bridge because it's at the edge of the beach. So you have the Mediterranean Sea right there. So it's really to continue the beach circuit and people biking bikes and running and so on. Actually, it's very, very much locals.
Have you seen the Serpentine winter this year?
No.
Has anybody seen the Serpentine winter this year?
Who did that?
Looks like you did it.
Who did it?
Yeah, I mean... well,
there you go.
It looks sort of like the Predator, but it also looks,
Yeah, well,
so
nice.
it's made
That's
out
how it
of...
goes.
what is it made out of? Like bamboo? What? I just thought you'd like to...
No, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I should have put it in there. Is it Bulgaria? What was the last museum?
That was a competition for Budapest.
Budapest, and that was the one also Marcella...
I mean, we didn't lose because nobody won. So we cannot say that we won, but at least we didn't lose.
Well, what happened?
For a change.
What, they just canceled the
they
whole
hated all the projects so much that they decided there was no winners.
Is that really true? And was there a juror that didn't show up or something like that?
I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened.
But that was, I mean, two things. It was clear that you backed off to some sense of plausibility in that project. I mean, the materials are clear.
Yeah, I think we did that one before the Guggenheim Helsinki. I think the Guggenheim Helsinki, we went more for something more possible. The Budapest was like, the competition really looked like a joke. didn't look like a serious competition, but we wanted to do it anyway. So we really wanted to push a bunch of ideas to the stream. But also with the animation, is one of the few animation in which we detach the film quality from the architectural quality. The thing that moves and whatever in the real building will not move.
Oh, is that right? I was
It
going to ask you.
it was an attempt to completely detach the logic of the film from the logic of the project.
It didn't look to me like it was meant to move mechanically.
Yeah.
It would look to me like it was meant to move like blowing in the wind kind of move.
It could be, I mean, but there was more a desire to display, I don't know, to do the thing.
But there's a much less resolution. The materiality, the surface of the eggs,
Yeah.
the number of them, the degree to which they're inflected and clustered, had a much lower resolution than all the work right before that.
Yeah, because I think for example, the whole notion with butchery and all that, there are a couple of things that interest me about it. It came from actually looking the work of a chef called Francis Malman, who combined very primitive way of cooking with very sophisticated. It was, I think within the last 20, 25 years of the development, people like myself who have been so interested in technology and digital tools and all that, there is a desire to produce contamination, to try to produce new coherency. So I think everybody and most of my colleagues here, they're in one way or another working on that, throwing different things to it. So for me, the notion of butchery, what it always been interesting is the relation between something that is very precise, the tools are very precise, but at the same time it's still something very primitive. So about killing an animal, mutilating the animal, and eating the animal. So there was those two things. So it was a desire to start to produce a certain notion of undefined, not defined, but the lower quality of precision in terms of shapes and forms and materiality, and something very refined or ornamental or shiny. So also that's part of what you do competition, is to test some of those ideas, to explore some of them. So in that sense, yes, there is a desire to produce like a lo-fi, hi-fi interaction at the same time, and I think it's one, I will say, it's probably my most current obsession, which is the idea to produce new coherencies, that you can put two contradictory logics. And if you ask me, I think that's the most important thing that computers has contributed to the discourse, is the capacity to produce new coherency about contradictory arguments, like to use rationalism and romanticism, and that you can produce something coherent out of that, which at the beginning of the 19th century was impossible to think that romanticism and rationalism can coexist. But if you think about it, computers are by definition ultra-rational machines, and softwares are that. And then you can throw all these other things, and new things will emerge. So for me, butchery or the grotesque or whatever else, they're all different agencies to figure it out, mechanisms how to deal with that. But the other thing was interesting about butchery is the idea of the three-dimensional geometry and three-dimensional cut and so on, which seems like a very interesting problem to be working when you work with this kind of animation softwares.
But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't really think of your work as, I mean, clearly it's based in digital technique, but it's driven by film.
Yes.
And it finds its, it moves in and with film.
Yes.
So it's not, and so for example, digital culture, the effect of multiple subjectivity, all the things that people that are involved in.
The work is very nostalgic in that regard, because
Right.
film is a fairly nostalgic medium in the
I mean,
contemporary.
you don't use multiple points of view, for example.
Well, we're starting to do that a little bit more. But for example, video game doesn't interest me, and I don't find it that compelling, that interesting. So in a way, I think my work is very nostalgic and melancholic in that sense, because I think films belongs to a different period of time as a cultural agency, but it's okay. I think architecture usually is nostalgic and melancholic, and but other mediums of digital, I have no interest in, for example, social network or anything like that. I'm not in Facebook, I'm not in Twitter. None of the things interest me whatsoever. So there is a lot of the contemporary digital apparatus that at the ideological level, I don't have that much interest. In my own work, I have an interest as a human being. I always separate myself as a human being and as an architect. To me,
But I mean, do you watch, you've watched Black Mirror or something like that?
What?
Black Mirror, do you know the TV show Black Mirror?
No.
So you don't really watch any of the movies that are about the degree to which digital life is
No.
partitioning the
Actually,
subject.
they drive me pretty much crazy, like movies like Her and I like that, and find them unbearable.
Well, that was unbearable.
Well, but in general, yeah,
Badly.
no.
You know that, just as an aside, Liz swears she gave Spike Jones, takes the credit for giving the idea to Spike Jones
About Her?
for her.
I will,
If I had
I will
done
not
that,
claim that
that's
idea
exactly
whatsoever.
what I was thinking.
But
So,
it's interesting how always architects and people in this world always think that they were the one that have the first idea about anything.
well, I mean, how big an idea is that? I've fallen in love with my car.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've fallen in love with my car so many times that I only get a new car when I'm on a trip like this, and Beverly has the other car towed away. So, how big a leap is it to fall in love with your iPhone?
I don't know.
So, any questions? Thoughts? What would it take, do you, what is it that's, how are you getting in the way of your building? I think it's pretty clear it should have been easier for you to build. I think the history shows it should have been easier to build. I don't think there's a real argument to be made. You can render your buildings in such an ephemeral way, all glass, all monolithic pieces. There's ways to make sure that no one sees them as, if you put a gigantic sphere of glass, then
I don't think there is a single answer for that. I mean, when you look of the body of work or career of certain architects who build less or more and so on, I think it's a combination of many answers. I don't think there is a single answer what gets on the way. First, I have to say, in my experience about my friends and colleagues, and some of them are my seniors and in many ways are my mentors, they have a burning desire to build them. Like they live and die by that. I have certain moments in my career that I feel like that, but it doesn't happen all the time. So I will say there is a part of my own responsibility about a certain level of commitment that you have to that sometimes I flunk at that, or I get distracted by other ideas. But also, to be absolutely frank and honest, I find very similar pleasures in the production of the project and the production of building it. Like again, I haven't built a building in a long time. I built buildings, actually I built things when I was very young. I mean, right after school at 24, 25, I built a bunch of stores, I renovated school. I did things that in a more traditional way of practicing. But in the last 10 years or so on, I remember when we did PS1. We did it, I love it, it was great. But I remember the level of satisfaction and obsession was not that different than a project that didn't get built. So I think there is a part of my own responsibility. The second one I have to do, you do what you do, and I have very little interest in compromise or take certain steps that you need to take in any kind of negotiation that requires to a project to move to the next phase. But at the same time, I think there is a certain evolution of the body of work, and it takes a certain amount of time and a certain relation that need to be established. And to be honest, any great building has been built. There was a good architect, but there was a great client too. I mean, you have also to find the right people that allow you to produce the work that you want to work and then produce and so on. But every project that we do is done with intention to be built. There are projects that we develop more or less. When you do a competition, you work in 2 or 3 weeks on it, and they go that far in terms of developing. But we always have a kind of a sense of how to do that, and I think that has to do with your own genetic code. I have a very hardcore classical modernist education in Argentina, Marcelo, myself, Florencia. We have all these ultra-rational teachers. Like, for example, when you were talking about plans in your presentation, if I show you carefully and you pay attention to the plans, I can show you that each project that we do, it works at the plan level. Not because it's a rocket science problem, it's because I spent a lot of years of my life doing that, and I was taught to do that. So to me, it comes like second nature.
But you mean works at the use level?
At the functional level, yes.
But does
But I don't find that interesting to talk about that. I don't find it honest to talk about that as a driving force of the project and so
But
on.
does the-
And by the way, I believe it's not that difficult to make that happen.
But does it-
So it drives me crazy when architects talk about that like that. It's a big deal.
But there are projects where the use function collaborates with the architectural work
Yeah.
to produce a higher
Yeah.
effect.
Yes.
Is that true in your work?
No, it would not be true in my work because I believe that function has a very limited life, much shorter life than anything else.
I mean, for example, do you ever choreograph the cinematic effects
Yeah,
of the...
yes,
you do?
no, that's we do. And there are certain projects more than others, like in the Helsinki library, I don't know, it seems like Helsinki brings that part in me, because the Helsinki library and the Helsinki Guggenheim was one of the projects in which the functional party was really important. Like in the library was a whole argument about that the box would be like a winter park, and the whole library would happen on that. And when we did the Guggenheim Helsinki, was reverse engineers of Guggenheim Bilbao Frank, meaning all the galleries will be the unfamiliar geometry, and all the public space will be the glass boxes. So it's almost the reverse. And,
But you never-
and we wrote that, and we explained that, and we make the argument for it.
But you never draw diagrams, for example?
No, I don't like diamonds. I find them unnecessary. I find that they kill the magic and the mystery of a project. And even with projects that we have clients, we don't do it. And that's maybe one of the reasons that we lose
Sure do have a
projects.
lot of diagrammers around for somebody. I said you sure do have...
I don't think I do it because I really cannot pronounce the word. So I always say diagrammatic logic because I cannot say diagram very well. No, I never did. I don't like them. I find it uninteresting.
Two of the students yesterday were arguing that the life of architecture in the media
Yeah.
is as important, if not more important, than the life of architecture in reality. And that, but for them, that meant that architecture in the media couldn't just be illustration of art. In other words,
Yeah.
that when architecture appears in a film, for example, it needed to appear in the film as by an architect with real architectural discourse, and then do its job in the film, and that would be distinguished from someone designing a set like Alex McDowell,
Yeah.
or, you know, and so they're trying to launch an idea. For example, they're going back and critiquing stuff like Minority Report. Any place architecture has appeared in the film has all sorts of fantasy qualities, and what would be the right architecture for that actually dealt with that problem of the film in an architectural sense? Would you subscribe to that notion?
To a point.
I mean, that they were quite taken with your work in that regard.
To a point. I still think that is the power of the thing built cannot be matched. I really believe that. Because when people say there are certain projects in architecture that are really important and didn't get built, but it's usually from people who build other stuff. So those unbuilt projects are part of a larger thing. So it's a tricky thing because you can argue that yes to a point, and you can argue that actually many of the buildings that we all admire, I mean, again, going back to that list, out of the 100 buildings that I wrote, probably I've been in no more than 30 of them. The other 70 I learned through books, drawings, and pictures. So one could argue that as a cultural production, that is part of the argument. But specifically with the relation with film, I think the problem is completely different. I don't think that that's a valid argument, and I think there is a flood of misunderstanding about how much you can move into mediums and expertise. Like when you work with somebody like Alex, when you talk with people like that, there was a project years ago that Doug Bailey, who was somebody close to me, was a very important visual effects guru in Hollywood. He was trying to get me to work on it. And we met, and I met with one of the producers of the film, and he said, no, we're not going to work with you. We love your work. It's interesting, but we don't like to work with architects. Why? He said, because you guys believe in what you do. And set designers, we are just hookers. The director tells us, oh, today is blue, we do a blue. Tomorrow he says, I want red, oh, we're doing red. And you guys will fight with us to death for your ideas. So there is a completely different conception about it, even though in these current times there is a certain similarities of disciplines moving to another one. The ethical logic, I think, of each field each field is very different. So the effects that you can, it's true that there is something about that in terms of the presence and all that, but the logic when you do it is very different. Like I have this conversation now when people say, oh, but your work is like art, and I say, no, why? Because I'm an architect. So even when I'm trying to do artistic work, my brain operates as an architect. When you talk to an artist, it's a completely different logic. They will never think in assemblies of this or that. They will never care about how the people move around. So there is a kind of intrinsic quality of it. So that's what I'll say. I'll subscribe to that to a point. I also believe architecture is not only about buildings, but you cannot erase the disciplinary memory of that. So that's what I'm saying. Everything that we do is with ambition to be built. Some of them it's more honest about it. Some of them are more fake about it. But also what is interesting is when, I don't know, in all these years in my own conversation with some of the distinguished people that you know, Pritzker winners and so on, and you ask, once in a while you ask a question is, hey, how you made it? I mean, how you went from have drawing exhibition to have $2 billion budget buildings or whatever it is, and they'll tell you the same. I really don't know. I hold to my guns, I keep doing what I wanted to do, I learned certain things along the way, you develop certain capacities to focus on certain things, and you have certain limitations and you have to deal with it, and I don't have a super clear commercial sense how to run my office, but
You know,
I want to do what I want to do, and if I can do it in my terms, great, and if don't, I will be happy to keep producing renders.
I asked Harry what he really thought about. I have 11 movies, 7 movies and 4 TV shows that use the bank. The building, the library building. And I asked him what he thought about it, really. How does he feel about it? And he says, I really like it because they always take the sign off the top. And he hates the sign. And did he tell a story? I don't know about it. They were going to make an addition to the top, put a tower, a spire on the top.
But Harry, the whole thing with Harry is interesting because it's a human condition. Like, he's such a smart guy and such a lovely guy that make you like the work way more than you would like it if you didn't know him. Because to be honest,
no question,
there are only 2 or 3 buildings that he did I will find interesting.
No, I mean, I went to bed
I find him very interesting, but I don't find his work that interesting.
I went to bed that night thinking this is the best work in the world. I woke up in the morning and thought, what am I talking about? This, first of all, something, this is what I mean.
That's what I'm saying. The power of the thing is the power of the thing.
Yeah, but you know why it gets a lot of work.
But that's what I'm saying. There are 2 different things about how you establish a way to make your work viable to people to consume and to build it, and your own interest and your own agenda.
I mean, let's close on that, because when he's in the courtroom and he's talking about, he's using the arches, the central arch and the various roof devices, tropes, to draw equality among the judges, the 2 litigants, and the jury and the public, the 5. So he's used these 5 circles, really, to draw equality. And he did that on the basis of analysis of 19th century courthouses. And later on, I said that everyone knows that the actuality of a courthouse today is to divide 3 circulations. The prisoners come in one way, the judges come in one way, and the public comes in one way. And that by the time you've come into the courthouse, the viability of those tropes is just ridiculous. When you're in that room, the power of the differences of the people in that room and how they got there is overwhelming any trivial architectural trope to the point of discrediting them. And that's the kind of discussion you can't have in a lecture, but that I think work like yours and work like we do here at SCI-Arc, in the end, has to address, not at the moment of that lecture, but it's not just not good, it's because that's the difference between a timeless value and a time-tested value that has now been rendered threadbare by the realities of the life of the building. And so I don't really think you can do that. I mean, I do think those are important issues, and that's why I think work like yours is absolutely crucial to understand. And that's an example, for example, of the function of a building changing the libretto of the form to a
No,
different.
look, I think it's totally doable. It just doesn't ring a bell with my own interest. I'm not saying that it's not a viable way to.
You're supposed to say, yes, I see what you mean. I think I'm going to do that.
No, but
Okay, guys. Y'all have any questions? Any comments?
Torquemada have to talk.
Todd.
It's in his contract.
No, yes, please.
She ran all the way
You
over.
were so quiet when you were sick.
I got to make up for it.
Okay, go ahead.
So I want to return to this question of time and timeliness, because I think it's crucial not just to Hernan's work, but to conversations today. I mean, a lot of the last bit of the discussion had to do in some way with building a kind of coherence out of dissonance, whether between the kind of disciplinary audience versus lay users, or kind of formal exuberance versus quotidian function. But Hernan said something that kind of slid by in the conversation, where early on he was talking about the necessity of, or his comfort with the work being kind of timely, that it kind of wears off quickly.
Right.
And then toward the end, you mentioned that there was a kind of current of nostalgia through your work as well, in its relationship to film. And I think that coherence between being simultaneously absolutely right now and also nostalgic is maybe the most, for me anyway, the most exciting of those dissonant coherences. And I wonder, especially given the reading of the Courthouse, if you guys could maybe build on that a little bit. I mean, is that a legitimate way to read the work, and how does that kind of spin out from there?
I mean, for me, the nice, the poetic aspect of your, I mean, nostalgia is always, whether you paint nostalgia in bright colors or in poor colors, it's always a fiction. You know, you're not nostalgic for a reality that ever existed. And so to be thinking about that, so his Rococo is not a real Rococo, or his Baroque is not a real Baroque. And so I do think it's well put, because it has a kind of currency that has a nuance of nostalgia that never existed, that could be used, for example, to not critique, but to reanimate tropes.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the other
Like
night...
those stupid flowers in that courthouse. I mean, I'm not stupid, but just the painting of those, you know, the way he decorated the arch, Harry decorated the arches, and I shouldn't call them stupid, but the use of the geometries to do those stencils.
Right.
There's not a architect in this room who doesn't have a technique to do that in a way that would have made those stencils belong to the period, remind everyone of that in a nostalgic way, but also bring it into another conversation about today.
But the notion of time, to me, is one of the things that interests me the most about films and animation, and to use that technique, is to incorporate the time base, the notion of time in the process of the design. To me, it's a fascinating problem. I mean, if you ask me, it's one of the things that fascinates me the most about the film, is the idea that in 2 or 3 hours, sometimes you can say 150 years of history. There's something about the manipulation of time and so on that to me is fascinating. And that's why I really like to use the construction of the animation and construction of the camera when we do the project as a way to start to read about that. There is a kind of a time quality into it, which I think is a way to negotiate the temporality of the now and the nostalgia that I think works. And there is something really interesting about that idea. But to be absolutely honest, I think one argue and talk about these things when you are in these kind of things. When you're doing the work, you tend not to think that much in those terms. I mean, I'm much more of this idea of the school of doing stuff. And then it's a kind of an autopsy process, and then you kind of unravel what you're doing. But that's why I'm so obsessed with techniques and meticulous things and obsession. That's what, for me, is much more interesting when I read about Bacon talking about what kind of paint, what kind of oil, and what kind of brush used, more than what Deleuze says about Bacon. So I'm much more obsessed in those kind of things of almost virtuosity, close reading of things. And to me, there's always a much more important word there. That's what I was saying, the time and all that. I don't think, I try not to worry that much about that, because I think it becomes a too heavy load to be carry on when you work in your projects. And I don't know, I always try to have a much more playful, light attitude towards the work. And there's something really interesting about that idea of time.
What are you reading now?
What I'm reading right now? Right now, I'm reading the bio of an Argentinian musician, Gustavo Cerati, who died last year. And it's all about how he did all these different albums. So it's all about very specific. His first record was in 1983. His last one was in 2009. So this book is all about the recording of each of his albums and how the technology came into play, and how he absorbed all that, and how he constructed the layer of music.
So you read a lot of biography?
I read a lot of biography, but I tend to focus on what the people were specifically doing a thing. Like, so I tend to like.
So you like to read technique?
I love to read about techniques and all that, and I have an amazing memory for those things. So I'm reading that. I'm reading the new bio of Steve Jobs, which is not. The other one was a little bit more interesting. I'm reading again Machiavelli.
I wonder what that's about.
Yeah, which seems like proper. And I'm reading Martin Amy's short stories and Christopher Hitchens' last book before he died. Those are the four things.
Hey, two points.
Thanks.
One has to do with the bridge.
With
The bridge. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's vibrating. The bridge. And when you never asked, at least in a utilitarian way, what's a bridge? Go from somewhere to somewhere, you can't get there, okay? So you make something that doesn't exist in order to connect 2 points heretofore not connected. So how do you get from Marin to San Francisco? Or how do you get from Brooklyn to New York? I guess you could take a boat. So when you're building something, there are, in a prosaic sense at least,
Right.
there are obligations that you have that you're going to have to confront that allow you to go where the land didn't go or the movement didn't go. So you're enabling something that heretofore didn't exist or was difficult to do. So let's build a bridge from across the Bering Strait and let's connect Alaska with Russia. Let's do that. So you never discussed that.
You know,
and if you hang on, if you say one of the problems you have is you have to put something down in the mud in order to hold it. So if you look at what's fascinating about the bridge proposal, a couple things. There's no obligatory structure. The reason it's a line in a conventional way, you could explain actually organizationally and in terms of implementing something which is difficult because it's deep and it's cold and you got to do that. Part of this context is different. It's different because operationally you can actually walk around. You just have to walk on the beach. So it's not really a bridge.
No, you can't.
Huh?
The river doesn't let you.
Oh, so you have to. So it is a bridge.
Yeah.
Then the route across the river isn't like this. It's like this.
Right.
So already the discourse, what Hernan proposed, is quite different in terms of the operational or the movement logistics of the thing. And the structure, because there's a technical aspect that allows you to do that or doesn't. And a lot of bridge discussions. I mean, there are long discussions about building a bridge across the Bering Sea.
Oh, of course.
To connect those and looking at what the problems are. So I think part of what he did has to do with redefining, a line to a goal or something else. It's a different way of looking at.
No, but I find it really interesting because I've written about bridges, Ben Van Berkel bridges, and I've always written and thought about and talked about what it's connecting, and I didn't in this case, particularly because I really don't think of it as a bridge. I think of it as actually a kind of episode. So for me, I mean, you're right. I thought, as soon as you said that, I thought, wow, I really
You
never.
called it a bridge, and maybe we
No,
should
you're
call
right.
it something else.
No, you're right, but I thought to myself, how is it that I never even thought? That's why I finally said what neighborhood is in.
Actually, we call it bridge, but in Spanish it's a pasarela,
Well,
which
look,
is different than a bridge.
It's
a
a
walkable
way,
surface.
it does two things. It's a way of getting from A to B.
Yeah, but.
And it's also C, in a way. The Ponte Vecchio is like that.
Right.
I mean, you can buy flowers, you can live there, and you can
Well,
go
let me just say
from-
that means that the design worked on me in such a way as to suppress its transitional qualities and to express its situational qualities, so much so that I never paid attention to the question you just asked.
Yeah, but what makes it interesting is that it deals with that question.
No
So
question.
if you leave that out, you made it a different
Absolutely.
project.
I mean, you're absolutely right.
The other one has to do with whether you should build it or whether you should look at it on your iPhone. And that has to do with, because Miller and I have this argument, he thinks that life is in Instagram. And he's not the only one. And I think they're dead wrong, and I think people who spend their lives making this sort of public relations job on a Facebook page, that's not where the reality is. And I think Hernan got it right when he said, it's what you make. It's not only what you make, it's the story of the people who make what you make. It's the building. It's not the photograph of the building or the image of the building. Rizzoli doesn't make architecture books anymore because all of the architecture is available online. But I think somebody has to decide what architecture is. And if architecture is the image of architecture, which seemed to be where we were going with this. This is very different than the architecture's the architecture. I think that's a big mistake, a huge mistake. And it not only has to do with architecture, it has to do with a fundamental idea about living and meaning of living and what's real. So that's the subject you're dealing with. Architecture is just a manifestation of what's
I
real.
understand. But I mean, we have to make architecture that conveys, in other words, we can't say you're making a mistake. We have to make architecture that makes it clear that it's a better thing to pay attention to in reality than it is in picture.
But
I
also,
mean, that's the difference.
I think you also, in
Those kinds of obligations.
Well, then, but you can't walk around the world saying, you're making a mistake, you're making a mistake.
Well, you raised the question, I'm just saying it to you.
but I think there is also a difference with this. I don't know. I always like to think that there is a difference between your obligations as the guy who's working on the problem and how the problem will be received or perceived. And I think you can only control to a point. So I think as far your obsessions are in the right place in relation to that context, the rest is what it is. I mean, like, I don't know. I think sometimes in this kind of debates we demand too much about what architecture does, and I think you can only control what you do as an architect. And then the rest, I mean, hopefully will not become an image, but it may become that. And
Well, I'm not saying you're going to convert anybody.
No, 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 but-
I'm just saying you need to know what matters to you. I want to see the Sydney Opera House. I get on a plane and I go to Sydney. I want to see Chandigarh. I get on a plane and I go to Chandigarh.
But do you
I
ever
don't
take-
look it up.
But when Miller sees something
Wikipedia.
he likes on whatever it is, Instagram, it would be fun to find out if he sees something he likes and then you take him to see the real thing, if it matters.
You know what he did? We sat on a beach the other day, Miller and I and Addie, photographing him throwing a football so he could put it on his Instagram. Not the game, not even the film of the game. Just, what the hell is that about? And you look at his Instagram thing, which I don't know. And
He's
shows
probably
it to-
selling advertising on his Instagram account, I don't know.
Well, I think if it were only him, were only he, that
Oh,
would
no.
be his problem. But
No,
I think it's symptomatic
No,
of
it
something
is.
which is much more substantial. You see it on every Facebook page.
Well, don't worry, we're going to run out of electricity.
Okay.
All right, guys, thanks.